Okay, so we're going to talk first a little bit about rubrics in general. Has everyone here used rubrics before? We'll talk about them a little bit in general, about why you may want to use them and why, how to do them within Brightspace. It's really going to be very similar to Blackboard if you use them before, but maybe some people will start using them who haven't before. So these are the things we're going to do. We're going to talk about what a rubric is, why you may want to use it, identify the components of and steps to developing the rubric, show how to construct one in Brightspace and have each one do that, and then maybe share some examples and try to make one. So we're going to try to allow enough time for everyone to work on this.
So lots of important reasons to use rubrics. Students shouldn't be left wondering what is expected of them. So using rubrics help clarify those expectations. It allows students to self-assess so that when they are completing their work, they can compare it against the rubric to determine whether they need to work on certain areas of the assignment and continue to improve in that way.
Because how many times have we given assignments and gotten back something that was not what we expected? And the reason was students didn't know what we expected. We can make very explicit what we want students to do. And by providing that structure, it can make a big difference in our work. It becomes a lot easier to grade student work when it's actually the types of things we were hoping they would do. And it's certainly a lot easier for students. And this is especially important for first-gen students, that providing this type of structure, research going back to Kim Tanner a couple of decades ago, continuing with Vijay Sethi and Kelly Hogan, and many, many others have found that this just providing rubrics and this type of structure and clear examples of what we want make it much easier for students to do higher quality work, and it reduces some of those equity gaps that we observe.
And in my experience, I find that I have to remind students that the rubrics exist several times. If you create a rubric and you don't share it with your students, or you don't remind them that there is a rubric there for them to check their work and such, it becomes less useful. So make sure students are well aware of that.
And we'll talk about that a little bit more in another slide about how to do that. In general, share it with them several times in several different ways. A nice thing about these using a rubric is it makes it easier to evaluate students fairly and objectively, because you have these well-defined criteria. And when you're looking at student work, you're not doing something impressionistic, which may be subject to bias. You may be influenced by their quality of the writing, especially if they're not a native English speaker. And it essentially encourages us to focus on exactly what we told students we're evaluating and not the general feel of the student's work.
This opportunity for very consistent and precise feedback that fosters improvements. Gives you the option to decide what is most important in your assignment, what are the important goals you want students to achieve, and how to accordingly assign points or percentages to that work.
And also in terms of the consistency and the precise feedback, quite often we have students do similar activities throughout the course of the semester. Or we allow revision and so forth. And by doing this, if you're allowing multiple drafts on a paper, we're giving students very consistent feedback that makes it easier for them to see the improvement, that they can see the rubric scores improving on specific components. And again, if they're going to do a discussion, say every week, they're getting precise feedback on the areas where they have some room for growth, and they can see that as they work through it. So by providing the feedback on the areas that they need, it lets students improve their work over time and see the improvement directly in the scores. And a nice thing about this in terms of gen ed or departmental assessment, is you can create rubrics that align with the gen ed assessment or with departmental criteria. And you can share that across all sections of all course or all the courses that are relevant. And it provides a nice standardized way of getting feedback on everything.
It's really easy to import and export rubrics so you can send them to your colleagues so that we don't have to reinvent the wheel. We can if you know a colleague has a really good discussion rubric, you can have them send it to you and you can import that, edit it to your course's needs. But yeah, certainly super useful for assessment.
And for example, if you're doing assessment of writing or assessments of some other criteria, let's say a gen ed criteria, you could do that by looking at student work separately, then grading it.
Sure.
But if you embed that assessment process directly in the course and let students know what they're supposed to be achieving towards that goal, it makes it a whole lot easier. You don't have to assess student work twice for two different reasons. Brightspace. There's some, in general, we can use it in a very similar manner to how it was used in Blackboard. You could assess assignments.
Yeah, so any essays, papers, that you have students submit. So, when you were creating those assignment links or those submission links for students, you can, do we have a discussion rubric? Yeah.
We have some, I can show you mine, but we also will provide a link to some resources shortly.
Yeah. Whatever type of assignments you're using, you can link rubrics to in Brightspace.
Basically, these are the equivalent of the assignment drop boxes in Blackboard.
Yeah. Any graded items. So you can do, so if you have students doing work outside of the course, so for instance, I have students who are submitting discussion points via Flipgrid, which is a third-party tool. I can create graded items in the gradebook and assign a rubric for those items and allow them to and use that as I'm evaluating it. I've also done this for like oral presentations, right? Where there's not necessarily, they may not necessarily have something that they're actually submitting for that, but I, have created a grade column for that and an associated rubric. So you can grade that accordingly.
And this was put together really quickly. It shouldn't say work done outside of the course. It's work that is done outside of the learning management system, outside of the platform.
Yeah, outside of the platform.
So, if students are posting videos on YouTube or TikToks or whatever else they're doing, that's not embedded in the LMS.
Yeah, you can still have those rubrics, created for, for your gradebooks in Brightspace. Discussions or journals, anything that you're, evaluating or assessing, in the course. So whether it's an official assignment or quiz, or, any of those discussion groups are useful too.
So in terms of sharing the rubric, a good thing is sharing it directly. You can share it as a file as part of your overview of the whole course when you describe what they have to do. You could share it in the module in which they first use it. You could also share it in your syllabus.
Yeah, lots of ways to, kind of remind students that those rubrics are there and that they're useful, not just for us, but for them to evaluate their own work.
And also when you create the rubric and associate it with anything, students, you can set it so that it's visible to students before they do that work, which is sharing it with them in multiple ways is really helpful so that students don't miss it. So this is a basic criteria, but what we're going to do actually is demonstrate that. I think it's probably going to be easier to do that.
Yeah, so, we can, we can send out those slides if people are.
Okay, it looks like I logged out. I did not mean to do that. Or it may be a third browser window.
Yeah, so if you haven't logged into Brightspace yet, you can do so as John is, oswego.edu/mylearning, and we can drop that into the chat as well. But that'll bring you to our single sign-on. He's already signed in.
Yeah, so it's too late to grab it.
Yeah, there's, again, it's /mylearning after oswego.edu.
Or if you want, you could go to mylearning.suny.edu, which is, will
And
be right at the
you'll-
top. It's a
Yeah,
redirect.
you'll be able to pick your campus and add that there too.
So once you're in, go to a course shell and you should have your fall ones there. So we'd encourage you to follow
Do you wanna
along
do
and
the fall
start
one?
this. Well, yeah, but it doesn't matter. Well, here I already have them. So let's
Gotcha.
just stick it. We'll create a new one and not use it. So go to one of your courses in an empty shell, or if you have material there, just go to it, because you can create rubrics without actually using them. You can
Yeah.
delete them later if you don't like it, but it's best way to do this is actually to try it and follow along.
So first, we're going to go to the course tools menu at the top, and we're going to go into course admin. So this is really, a useful directory where you can access, course building materials, throughout the course. So it's a really useful area to go. So if you go down to assessment, you'll see rubrics. So go ahead and click on that. And you can, if rubrics have been imported from Blackboard, they should populate here. But you can also, you can search for them. You can also create new rubrics using that box above.
And let's do that. So we'll work through it from the beginning. And again, we encourage you to do this as we talk about it.
Go ahead and click new rubric. You can create its title here. So let's say you want to do it for a discussion post.
Well, let's try
for an
something because I've
assignment?
already got some of
Okay.
those. Let's say class presentation.
Okay, yeah, class presentation is a good one.
You have two choices. You could do analytic or you can do holistic. Holistic is essentially like analytic, except there's only one criteria, which probably isn't as informative. But if you want to, well, if you're doing specifications grading, for example, you might do that. And it might be either this passes or it doesn't, or you could, or if you're doing light grading, you could do this meets the criteria, this approaches it, and this does not meet the criteria. So you could use a small number of criteria, and it could be just a holistic evaluation. But basically, that's a subset of analytics. So let's stay with analytic.
Yeah, most people, I think, creating rubrics are going to want an analytic rubric. So it gives you different categories of, areas to grade on. So this should, look fairly similar to, creating rubrics in Blackboard.
One difference is actually something that people have recommended to Blackboard for ages, and that is to start with the highest level criteria and work down, because you don't want to start by students looking at the lowest possible level of work, creating an exemplar of what you want to see, and then talk about ways that may fall short of that is probably a better way of establishing, the goals for students.
And you can reverse those level orders if you choose, but it's very simple to switch that. Whereas in Blackboard, you had to retype everything. So this makes it much easier. You can add.
You could add additional.
Or you can add additional columns there. So if you use a 5-level rubric, you can add additional columns
Probably don't want 5. So and if you want to get rid of them,
right? If you wanted to
you
delete
could
them,
just
you can certainly
delete
do that
it.
too.
Delete.
Yeah, so you can add the titles in place of, levels. So if it's exemplary or, or use lots of, words, I don't know, distinguished or something, or proficient. There's lots of examples of rubrics. We'll show you a few. You can also search online for it. You can ask your colleagues. Mostly the titles are to your style and your what you want to communicate to your students, right? So by saying approaching proficiency or does not meet the criteria, those are kind of easy or nicer ways to as opposed to saying failing or kind of using harsher language. So there's use those titles as you see fit for your class.
And basically, whatever criteria you want to evaluate students on would be the criteria.
Yeah.
And you get to choose the weights, and you get to choose whether it's a percentage or points. It doesn't really matter which you use because it will convert from one to the other. Let's say if you wanted to, let's go with percentage. Well, no, I guess custom points. We could do custom points. No, let's go back to just simple points. I haven't used custom points, but you don't have to do it on a 4 or 5 point scale. We could do each one on a 100 point scale, which would effectively give you percentages. So if you want to do it with percentages, the highest level could be 100% of that.
Sure.
Proficient, maybe that's 80 or let's say 85.
Yeah.
Maybe approaching this might be 70 or, well, 70, so wherever you think would
Whatever
be
you think
appropriate.
is.
And then here you probably put a 0 or something, and then give them opportunities to, revise later.
So, if you, this is for a presentation, right? So if you want to, talk about application of course content, that might be the most, that might carry the most weight, right, in your presentation. If you're a public speaking course and maybe, the actual speaking is something that you want to, so maybe clarity of presentation or something like that. There's a lot of whatever criteria you want to include. You can add criteria, you can delete criteria to suit your needs.
And in each of these, you can define for students what exemplary criteria would be. Mm-hmm. So it could be effective, let's say, use of course concepts, and perhaps transfer of course concepts to new applications. So not only are they using the concepts correctly, they're doing it in a way they hadn't seen in their course. And then proficient means maybe generally accurate, application, etc. And and basically you define where, in words, a sentence or two, what would satisfy exemplary work, proficient, approaching proficiency, or not meeting it. And you do that for each of these. And if there's some standard feedback that you would typically provide, you can even automate that by putting it here. You could say, great job on, on doing this. And that would automatically appear in the text for students when they see their rubric scores. Notice it suggested the total number of points for that to 100. Yeah. For here, you could assign different points for it. Well, actually, I guess this is still out of 100. So
yeah, and for that initial feedback, I'd suggest that if student did not meet those expectations, that in that initial feedback, you said, please reach out to me, schedule a meeting, for us to talk about this. So that is really easy way for you to communicate to them that you care about their progress and that you want them to be successful in the course, and here's the steps that they should do to get there.
And you may also want to share some resources that they may want to review, as well. But encouraging them to meet with you would be helpful. And by default, these are now all on a 100-point scale, but you can add new criteria groups. So if you wanted different weights on individual items, you can do that. So maybe this will be 100 points. Maybe the next category, you could add a new criteria group where you could get rid of, let's say those are two that you want to be 100 points equally weighted. You could add a new criteria group here where this may be a smaller share. And maybe this one, instead of it being 100 points, it might be all 20 points. Well, let's say 20 points will be highlights. Well, yeah, we should have worked the way out. So let's say this will be maybe 12, maybe this would be 17, or let's say 18, and that will be 20. So so in general, there'd be 20 points out of the total number of points for this activity for this. Or if you want to do it as percentages, instead of using 100, maybe if this is 40% of the grade, the high score would be 40, and you could add it up that way.
Yeah.
It'll compute it all automatically, but the relative weights on here should correspond to how much weight you place on each set of criteria.
Right. So once you have, that kind of just determined, right, what that total score is, what each criterion weight will be, you can then provide a overall level of achievement based on that rubric score, right?
And this is new. This is not something we had in Blackboard.
Right.
So you would define whatever levels you think, and you could call this, for example, if you want to use letter grades, this could be an A. You could have as many, you can add more criteria to this separately, and you could define what scores would represent an A. Or again, if this is used for feedback, which is more helpful in terms of learning, you could just, again, use something like, what was the first category?
Exemplary.
Exemplary.
So, if exemplary is maybe 200 or more points, right? So even if they didn't get, a full score on, one of those criterion, they would still, overall get a exemplary score, right? Proficient could be 180 or more, and, you can create those ranges as you see fit.
And when you're all done, you would go down to options. And this is really important to set the options. And in specifically, the default is really good here, unlike Blackboard. In Blackboard, one of the most annoying things is that by default, it did not show the rubric to students unless you went through a whole series of unnecessary mouse clicks to do it. By default, it will show it, but make sure that you're sharing the rubric with students.
It's best practice. Students should understand how they're being assessed and be able to use those assessments to evaluate their work.
Now, if you're purely providing formative assessment for feedback to students and you don't want to give them scores, or if you're using an ungrading approach, you do have the option of hiding the scores. So if you don't want students to see the numeric scores, then you can hide it and they would only see the feedback. They wouldn't see the numbers associated with it. Again, for feedback, it can be really useful because when students get grades, often the only thing they see is the number.
Is that number, and that comments that you've given them fall by the wayside when they see that letter grade or that number grade.
And what you may want to do is provide, if you're doing paper drafts all the way through, you may want to provide them with a grade at the end, but while they're working on drafts, you could call this rubric a paper draft rubric. You could duplicate it and it would be the final one. And the only difference would be you'd hide scores during the process where they'd only be getting constructive feedback, and then you could share a score at the end. And so, in general, though, if it's something that's going to be part of your grading criteria, you want students to be able to see how they're being evaluated. But if you're providing feedback on the draft, you might not want to provide them with numeric scores, but you do want to let them know where there are areas of improvement.
Yeah, so you can write a description. Again, that's just for your use. So if you're using this in a particular course for oral presentation in this course, you can, add that information in there just to help yourself keep that organized.
Now, this next thing is checked by default. We don't have these yet, or they're not implemented in ways that we might like. What some campuses have done is they've built in the learning objectives for each course into the competencies in Brightspace or in Blackboard and so forth. We haven't done that yet, but in terms of gen ed criteria, in terms of the learning objectives for each course, at some point you can define competencies and have this map into specific ones that, again, could be used for transparent assessment. We're a long ways from that happening at this point. So unless you define your own competencies for the course, which is another tool, you may want to leave that. You probably could leave that unchecked for now.
Yeah,
but
it's something we can circle back to once it's available.
And in the meanwhile, you've created a rubric with some missing definitions, but we just click close and the rubric is now available.
So that was class presentation is what we've created. So that's now available to be associated with, a grade column.
And it's published by default. You could use it as a draft. You could archive it if it's an old one. You don't want to see it cluttering up your menu. This is just one example here of a rubric. I've got 2 discussion forums, and this is just what I use, where they met expectations, they approach it, they partly met it, or they didn't meet it, and I just give them different points for each criteria. And then I set the thresholds for that, let it be visible, and so forth. And the criteria I use were basically spacing of participation, because one issue is with discussion forums, students will generally, if they're not given any guidance or any sort of nudging to spacing the workout, students, like all of us, tend to wait until the last minute, like some of this presentation was put together by what I do is in this semester, their modules are due on Sunday nights. So I have them, I ask that they, this is not the one I'm using, but basically they have to submit the first post by Friday, two days before the end of the discussion, just to nudge them in that direction. This is actually an older rubric. I'm using the other one.
So you can add spelling and grammar if you'd like. You can talk about their original post as well as their replies.
And I actually 99% of the time will give them full credit on that, because I don't generally penalize for that.
Right.
But by putting that as a criteria, it encourages them to be a bit more careful and use complete sentences and punctuation. And it just makes it easier for everyone to read each other's posts, even though it's probably been 3 or 4 years since I docked anyone for spelling or grammar, in large part because they're a lot more careful if they know that it potentially could be an issue.
And it's something to keep in mind, because it could certainly disadvantage students who don't have English as their first language. So deciding on how many points to assign to that, or whether to put it on the rubric, but then always kind of make it a point to give everyone full credit, is something to keep in mind.
Yeah, and I debated. I have thought about taking it off, which I might do at some point.
Yeah.
But I do remember before I listed this that a lot of people would just write everything in lowercase and they'd use internet slang. That was a while ago. That was a couple of decades ago. But in general, when I have this there, it does seem to result in better writing.
Mm-hmm.
And again, if someone's not a native English speaker, that comes through pretty clearly, and I wouldn't penalize them for that, even though it is technically listed there. Most of the weight in here is on their application of economic analysis and providing substantive discussions and so on.
Mm-hmm.
So what we wanted to do now is to let everyone create one. We were hoping more people would be here in person. We could wander around, but let's give you some time to create one. And then if you have any questions, just raise them and we'll try to answer them. And then if anyone would like to share their screen and talk about their rubric, we could do that. But we want to give more hands-on time for this, especially than the last session.
Yeah.
I'd encourage you to get started on creating a rubric if you already have one. And basically, whenever you create any assignment, there is simply the option of adding a rubric. And once you've created in there, it will give you the whole list. You just select it, and then it becomes part of that tool. And we'll show, let's take a bit of time to do this, but then we'll come back and we've got a couple more slides showing what it looks like when you actually evaluate things.
Mm-hmm.
Questions? Good if we just do the other slides, because one of the things we share there are some resources. So let's go back to that just for a second. Because I was hoping more people would be in person. It would be just a little easier to get a feel for this. So let's share the screen again. And let's go back to our presentation, which is the other screen. Here we go. So, we do have a question.
Well, thank you, Sandy, for offering that. So, Sandy's, has a lot of experience with rubrics. So if anyone has questions, totally reach out to her.
And Sandy provides some great feedback.
Yes.
She sat into my class and gave me some really good advice things that I knew but hadn't quite implemented,
Yeah, during the open classrooms projects.
which is
lots of,
wonderful.
great opportunities there.
Just to show you what it looks like, once you've assigned a rubric, it just shows up when, what would happen here is when I go into the quick eval screen in to grade students discussion formats, their discussion post for each student would be listed from earliest to the last one. And you get this little thing on the right. The bottom of that looks a lot like Blackboard. This is 5% of their overall grade. So these are percentages. So basically you could just enter a grade and leave it with a little text feedback. But if you just click on that little triangle up here in the top right, the rubric will just expand and it will look something like this. And it's just a really neat and clean format where if you hover, it's not here because this isn't live.
This is just an image.
It's just an image, but I was using a forced point rubric. And because the highest one is first, if you hover over that leftmost box, it will state the criteria. You just select it, and then you could add feedback to that specific component. You scroll down and it does it for each of the criteria you have. And it's so much cleaner and simpler. And you don't get that huge menu if you have a lot of text there that you had in Blackboard. So it's really nice, intuitive. For me, I find it much easier to use a rubric. Well, a bit easier because it worked before, but
Sure.
it's easier to see the definitions by hovering over each of those little boxes in that row.
Yeah, so again, it's there are a lot of resources. Brightspace has a lot of really excellent YouTube videos, YouTube channel, and resources available. So, whether it's rubrics or other, creating content in your courses, there's a lot of options there. So John has a QR code and a link here for, some additional resources on rubrics. So definitely check those out if you have questions. And if you have any questions that you want to drop in the chat or unmute and ask. But yeah, we really did want to create some time for people to get started on their own creating a rubric. So if you wanted to share your screen, you're welcome to do that too.
Yeah, here's some specific Brightspace rubrics, some general information about creating rubrics, some general Brightspace resources, and some general ones. These are related to rubrics in D2L. Well, actually, that one belongs down there. Never mind. Well, sorry about that. Here's some general Brightspace resources, which are really good. Vanderbilt has an incredible array of information, or a very large collection of information for faculty. These examples might be helpful as you work through it. So we'll stop the share now and let you work through it. And if you have any questions,
we're here.
And if you'd like to share an example of a rubric you created, please do so.
Yeah, we'd love to see them.
Or if you experience any problems, we could all work together and diagnose it, or at least try.
Hi, John, Maggie. Just wanted to say thanks. Made a rubric. It seemed pretty straightforward. Really like the options. So things are working good. I know it's kind of hard when you're in a quiet room with a bunch of Zoom people, not knowing what's going on out there. But so thanks.
Thank you for
Very
chiming
clear.
in.
Appreciate it.
Thanks, Nick.
And if anyone would like to share rubrics they created, that's great. That would be great.
I'm happy to share my discussion rubric if anybody wants to see it.
Yeah, do you want to share your screen now or?
Yeah. Yep, here, I'll do it. This is Sandy. So it's a funny, I've used this rubric for, I don't know, at least 10 years probably. But one of the this is for discussion online courses only. But one of the things I changed because one of my colleagues, actually Jessica Harris, was in the, demonstrates developing writing skills for the discipline. I always had writing is clear and concise, but the big thing I changed is down here. I added a word count to my discussion posts because discussion posts in my class really are about showing that students can apply the knowledge in, hopefully a new format or to themselves, or to their life or to their work. And yet I still couldn't get them to, and they have to cite course materials that are assigned. So it's not like, hey, this is what I feel like. But one thing I changed was I added a word count, 300 word count post and 150 word count response criteria. And that really upped the, sort of the expectation. And I think the quality that students said, oh, this discussion isn't just like, yeah, I agree. Oh, hey, nice post, John. So that was a big change I made this year, and it really made a difference.
And it's again, telling students what your expectations
Right.
are and how they, create that is incredibly helpful for students.
Right.
And I never use that either, but I'm gradually being convinced it's a better idea. I was always reluctant to put in page counts or word counts.
Right.
I didn't want students to pad it, but we were talking to Linda Nielsen on a podcast, and one of the things she said is, she really doesn't like doing it either, but she does because students see it as an indication of how much effort to put into things.
Correct.
And when there's a larger word count, it means you're expecting more for them. And that sort of information is especially helpful for the students who haven't been exposed to these types of expectations in their high schools or in earlier courses. Again, so doing that does not harm the students who would normally write quite a bit and provide substantive responses, but it does provide an some suggestion for students who are not used to those expectations, who would otherwise be at a disadvantage. So it's a good way of equalizing the playing field. So everyone has the same shared expectations.
Right. One of the other things, just you can see under my criteria in the left-hand column, I weight each area, so it's 30% is demonstration of understanding of, prompt, 20% is writing skills. And for this is for my IPS 320 class, the new integrated professional studies, which is a writing intensive course. So I feel like that had to be really overt and sort of intentional, that writing is important here. And it's 20% of your discussion post. So that's a switch for a lot of students who, use a lot of bad punctuation and bad capitalization. I'm like, this is the writing intensive part of the course. 20% about demonstrating understanding of the prompt through taking the discussion to a higher level of discussion, critical thinking 20%, and then sort of disposition and demeanor is 10%. So, not everybody weights each of the criteria, but I've always done it that way, and magically Blackboard creates a grade. So.
And again, it's kind of telling students what's most important, where to kind of, focus on making sure that their responses are adequately achieving those areas.
I'm having home construction done right now. It's getting very noisy here. So
Thank you, Sandy, for
Thank you,
sharing.
Sandy.
Thank you.
And the word count is a really good idea. And I'm gradually being convinced I got to start doing that too.
Yeah. And, it's also another point to, not reinvent the wheel. Like if, colleagues have really good rubrics or they've talked about them and, I'm sure most people are happy to share. So, reaching out, they can export their rubrics from Brightspace and send it to you. You can import it in. It's, if it was in Blackboard, you can do the same. And, it's great to, be able to share that kind of information with each other.
And one thing that's better, well, one of many things that's nicer in Brightspace than in Blackboard is that in Blackboard, you could often only export a whole category of things. You could export individual rubrics, but
Right.
with many things, you can export individual tests or individual rubrics. So you could select from all of your, export it, give it to someone else. They could import just that item, and then it could be shared. And we don't know yet because SUNY has not yet activated the Learning Object Repository. It's quite likely that it'll be easier to share things within departments by storing them there. And then anyone who is part of that part of the hierarchy would be able to add it to their course. So we'll know more about that as SUNY builds that. But so there's still a lot of features in Brightspace that are not yet, well, that's the main one that's not yet available. Most of the rest is there.
Lots of potential.
So there may be even more potential for sharing. Any questions, any problems you're encountering, or this is where we'd be wandering around looking over people's shoulders and asking
Dennis,
how it's going.
Go for it.
Okay. This would, I should have learned this in Blackboard, but what I tend to do is do a holistic grade for the post and then for the feedback. So it's 15 and 5 points, for example. So it seems like this will show, especially if I set it up, the breakdown rather than having this, do, I don't know, like 8/2. It seems like and then I guess it'll show up. You have to hook it up to the grade book, but it'll just go right to the grades.
This will automatically be, well, when you create the discussion or the assignment, one of the categories or one of the tabs you get after you created it is the assessment tab. And that's where you would put the category of the item, whether it's a discussion, whatever the broad buckets are, you'd select
Right.
that, and then the specific item, when it becomes available in some other general settings, and it would automatically go into the gradebook. But you did bring up a point that we didn't discuss, partly because I don't think either of us has used it yet. And that is, you have the ability to evaluate individual posts so that I've used it as a rubric for the entire week's worth or the entire discussion forum, but you could set it up where there's a rubric for individual posts. And I'm not quite sure if you can do both individual posts as well as, the whole set. Kathy, Mike, do you know anything about that?
I do not.
So I'm just wondering, so you're talking about like maybe evaluating discussion for that module out more holistically, yet with
Yeah.
separate criteria. Now you're messing
Right,
with
and
me.
the question is, how would that aggregate into the whole grade? Let's share the screen and go back to the rubric creation tool. Well, actually, let's go back to well, I can show you how I set up my discussions. For example, if I go, let's exit from here and let's go to course tools and go to, this will get into a little bit discussions, which we'll be talking about in the next hour, but let's take a look at this, because I am curious about that. It's something I haven't played with because it's been a busy few weeks here, but let's go to, where are the discussions? Right here, the discussions under communication. And when you pick a discussion, what happens is, let's pick one of the discussions here. You first define the categories, and I have two, which are the forums, which is a little bit different, but I'm going to go here and choose edit the topic. Okay. And in the topic under assessment, there is discussion of, well, you add this, but you see there is a checkbox here, which is allow assessment of individual posts. And then underneath it, there's the option. This is one that actually students had already done, so I'm not quite sure what would, let's click the question mark. So it's whatever the suggestions. Under the calculation, it may be just an average of if you want to evaluate each student's post, then there's some criteria you could use. That's not active, just to be a little bit safe. I don't want to mess with, let me just go back and pick a discussion form that's not yet active. I guess I may have to. I'm sure there's a more direct way, but I'm going to go back to course admin and discussions because I don't want to fumble any more than I've already done here. We go to discussions, and that should pop up any second. And now let's go down to one that's not yet active. Come on.
The scroll is like not been working for us, so.
This has been an issue for the last, well, for the first week. So if we drag it down, it will work. So here we'll go to, well, let's go down to, this is a different discussion. Oh, that one's actually active right now. Here we go. This is one that is not yet active. So we're going to edit the topic. And we're going to go to assessment. And let's see what happens. So we're going to now click allow assessment of individual posts. Okay, so you,
Yeah,
instead of evaluate the whole thing.
Yeah, it'll give you options, right, to have the average post score, the maximum, the minimum, You could do the mode if you have, several, if you're requiring students to respond to 4 students, right? Or, and if they are submitting a number of posts, that might be something you consider. You can have the sum of all of them as well.
So 3 or 4 or 5 weak posts may add up to the equivalent of 1 or 2 or 3 strong posts, for example. Or you could have, require at least one of them be high quality of a given level or whatever. So you've had a lot of flexibility there and so forth. And you could have unassessed posts and the calculated topics were at 0. So I don't know why. But,
yeah, I don't know why you'd want to do that either.
But in any case, you do have that option if you want to score them as they come in. And that way you could be monitoring the discussion and giving them feedback while they still have time to adjust within that discussion, rather than waiting for them to be able to do better the next time. They're getting immediate feedback if you're going to be grading them on a,
regular,
let's say a daily basis. At least.
So, whatever suits, your, the way you manage your course is probably what would inform if you decided to do that option or not. If you're grading once a week, it probably doesn't necessarily make sense if they're not going to get that feedback in real time.
Unless you want to assign,
Right.
Low points for
Right,
very short,
sure.
For those I agree type posts that we always get, no matter how many times we remind them not to do that. But they could still agree with people and be agreeable as their preference. And then as long as they add some substantive ones later, then that's fine. One of the things you do have an option in a discussion forum of allowing upvoting or downvoting. I allow upvoting only so that if other people agree with something, they do have the option, instead of saying I agree, they could just give it an upvote. And people who are used to Instagram and so forth, tend to appreciate getting those upvotes.
Any other questions? Because we are kind of wrapping up this hour. If anyone wants again to share their screen, if they're coming up, with anything, again, you can certainly reach out to John and I. We're both in the, John's teaching right now. I'm in the process of building courses that will go live next week. So there will be lots of time, spent on creating rubrics. So if you do have any questions, welcome to answer those as they come in.
In my very first week, I just want to mention student feedback, because I know everyone's a little apprehensive about this, as I have been, because it is a bit of a work. I asked students what their concerns were about the course, and nearly all, as that metacognitive cafe discussion, a low stakes thing, and nearly all of them mentioned one concern was moving to this new environment. But one of the things they were saying in their later posts is they were apprehensive about it, but they find it to be much more intuitive than Blackboard, and it also has a lot of really nice features that make it easier to navigate, especially all the things that are in the calendar in a way that's perhaps a little more transparent for them. And the checklist is something that they really, really like, that they can make sure that they're doing everything they're required to by just looking at the checklist. And I haven't done this yet, but it's possible to link it to the individual items. It's just, there's so much I can do it.
There's a lot of really cool possibilities in Brightspace. So, I think probably best way to manage all those possibilities is kind of structure things the way that, gets you going, and then explore those additional tools as you move on and you have time and energy to tackle those new things.
Okay.
All right.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, please reach out if you do have more questions. We're happy to answer them. And take care.
And we'll see some of you later.